Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. So today on the show, I'm very excited to welcome Danny Markstein. Danny is an experienced communications professional with more than 2 decades of experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He founded Markstein in 2003 as a strategic consulting agency. Today, Markstein is a full-service creative comms agency, and you can learn more about them at markstein.co. Danny, great to have you on the show.
Dan, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm real happy to be here with you.
Yeah, so we had a conversation, 6 months or so ago, and I wanted to have you on for a couple reasons. For one, you seem to be very successful as a well-specialized niche agency, and it's always great to learn about how people kind of came through that journey and made it work, because a lot of agencies are struggling to figure that out at all times. The other reason I wanted to have you on is you brought up some truly kind of staggering facts about the US workforce and what we're looking at. So I would really like to dig into all the above. Before we get started, can you talk a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are with Markstein?
Sure. Well, I'm not entirely sure how I got here, but I'll give you some of the facts. So, born and raised in Birmingham, went to college in Connecticut. It was very cold. After college, went to DC, and after working 4 or 5 years in Washington, went and got a business degree from George Washington University. While at GW, I wrote a strategic plan or business plan for a consultancy that largely helped other companies develop business plans and strategic plans and marketing plans. And long story short, life led me back home to Birmingham, where I rehung this shingle and really evolved what was a consulting firm into what today is a full service agency, real focused on employer branding and workforce solutions.
Very cool. And good on you for actually building a viable business out of a university business plan. Usually those things just end up in a dust pile or something like that. So that's pretty cool. I guess to do a little sidebar on that, you hear a lot of very kind of polarized opinions on business school and that sort of thing. Like, what was your experience with it? What were the good and the less useful things about it, I guess?
I think one of the great things about it was, and I don't know if this is true today for young professionals in their mid to late 20s, but I think you get to a place in your career before grad school, if you have gone the traditional sort of college route, you've entered the workforce. By the time you're 27 years old or so, you're kind of too young to be old and too old to be young, and you kind of start banging your head against the wall. And for me, grad school was a great opportunity to get out and sort of expose myself to a lot of other people in a similar position who had had a lot more diverse experiences than I had had. And it really opened my eyes to different types of options, different types of career paths, and a network, frankly, that I didn't have before. So for those reasons, it was really great for me. But, it is not cheap to go back to school, but I would definitely recommend it to folks who have that type of interest.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So bouncing back to Markstein, what were those early years like? What did the first clients you took on tend to look like back then?
And we had our first 2 clients before we graduated business school. And I thought, man, this is going to be really easy. It's difficult to hang a shingle and grow a business. And I think for people getting started, it's easy to follow your passion. And in the early days, you're real scrappy, but the busier you get, the less time you have to develop business. And then you look up and you finish a project and you got no work. And as you grow and you start hiring people to join your team, suddenly you are further and further away from the work that you were passionate about pursuing in the first place. So as you know, hanging a shingle is not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, it's funny because I've been in such a weird position because my tradesperson specialist skill is sales and lead gen. And then that also happens to be the thing we sell. We're kind of weird in that way, right? I think most people have a trade and then they have to go sell that trade. So it's kind of like a mirror looking at itself with what we do. So I guess with that in mind, like what did that look like back then? And how did you sort of figure out those initial hires and what did you decide to get off your plate first? Maybe and also was this 20 years ago or how long ago is this now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I founded the business 21 years ago, which it makes me feel very old. And originally we were a consulting firm and moved to Birmingham. The opportunity to leave Washington, D.C. and move to Birmingham was to acquire an existing agency that was here. And fortunately, and perhaps fortuitously in hindsight, it didn't work out. It was very painful at the time, but it's funny how life has a way of sort of taking care of those kinds of things. But the good news in retrospect is that deal did not work out, and I was forced to hang the company that I'd started in DC. And really, I wish I could say that the company's growth and evolution was super strategic. I think the market kind of pushed us down certain paths, and we were responsive to those needs. And it's really led us to a place where I think our team feels very fulfilled based on the type of work that we're doing today. And it's work that's really meaningful to our clients. So it has not been the most predictable career path, but it's certainly been the most fulfilling I could imagine.
Yeah, that's great. And before we get into how that specialization happened, can you just talk from a high level, like what are you guys actually doing? Like what do the services look like and clients and so on?
Sure. We're a creative agency like just about any other that may be viewing this podcast, but we developed really about 7 years ago or so, started to develop an expertise in workforce solutions, both focusing on the recruitment side, talent attraction campaigns, and retention. Both of these are equally painful points for a lot of our clients in the industries in which we work. So, we still do, certainly in Alabama where we're based, we still do more or less all things to all people that you would expect in a comms shop. But outside the state, if you've heard of the agency, it's probably been because of our work in employer branding and workforce solutions.
Got it. Makes sense. So with workforce solutions, that's basically described as like retaining and attracting talent as opposed to just the cultural communications and sort of, internal comms and stuff. What did it take to get there and where are you now? Are you guys fully specialized on that niche or is it a portion of your revenue? How would you describe who you guys serve?
So our workforce, it yields about 65% of our revenue today, I would say, employer branding and workforce initiatives. Our clients tend to be large employers, multi-site employers who may have a very large footprint. We also do a lot of work for industry associations and coalitions who have come together to try to solve these problems. Unfortunately, these are very significant problems. The numbers just don't work, and they're not going to go away anytime soon. And the reality for our economy is it's going to have a ripple effect over time. So it's great, I think, for our business. It's exciting for our team. It's sort of our mantra is connecting people to fulfilling career paths. And that certainly has been a great experience. And I think it's a fun problem for our team to go and solve. But the challenge is real and there's not an easy solution here.
Yeah, I'd love to dig further into that. Can you talk a little more about how that's playing out and what those kind of numbers based limitations look like?
Sure. So our gross domestic product obviously has slowed recently. It's not going to increase significantly over the next several years. At least it's unlikely to. That is a challenge. The workforce numbers are also distressing. Today, I think the reality for our country, workforce participation spiked around 2000, but it's been declining since 2008. And the pandemic really accelerated that trend. And because we are not growing as a population as fast as we once did, we just don't have the number of people necessary to fill all of the jobs that are available today by the existing workforce. So, for example, in the state of Alabama, and Alabama is just a microcosm for the rest of the country, unemployment, it's crept up over the last couple of weeks and couple of months, but it's still at relatively historic lows. And participation in Alabama, the national average is a little over 61% right now. In Alabama, we're under 57.5%. So if Alabama is a microcosm, you have a relatively small workforce population versus the need. And then only a little better than 1 out of 2 people are choosing to participate. It just exacerbates that problem. Sort of to put a finer point on it, again, in Alabama, if during this podcast, the recording of this podcast, unemployment in Alabama goes to zero, let's just say, we are still 71,000 people shy of the number of open jobs in our state today. So that's the type of gulf that we're talking about. And This is a national problem. This is actually a global problem. A lot of developed nations are seeing this happen. Japan is seeing this happen. China also. So it's automation will help to some degree, but it's not a solution. And just because automation happens in a particular industry, it doesn't mean jobs go away. It means skill sets and requirements change. So the numbers don't work and the solutions are not going to be the flip of the switch.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And it also, like, all you ever hear are these kind of politically manipulative statements about employment rates and all these sorts of things when it masks this deeper problem. And I'm sure that data is reported and people know about it, but it's not something that's in the main Overton window that we're all kind of getting exposed to all the time. So I guess with that, how is this problem playing out? Like, for example, is this more focused on blue collar or white collar?
It's affecting every industry
Mhm.
right now. There's no one is sort of immune from this problem. Competition for talent is pretty fierce. Turnover remains a challenge. It's not as high as it once was, and certainly not as high as it was during the pandemic. But at the same time, the challenges are very, very real. And I think at the end of the day, the businesses and industries who do a better job reaching qualified audiences are going to fare better. Most of what we hear from our clients, whether it's an employer or an association or a coalition, is we are struggling to get quality candidates relative to our need. Time to hire needs to be compressed more than it is. And there are some solutions that we can provide there too, but it's just something that we've observed. I mean, if you think about if I have a really highly qualified candidate and it takes me longer than the next guy to convert a candidate to someone who I've offered a job to, I have a greater chance of losing that person. And retention is a real challenge. I think the statistics that you read, may vary, but what we hear from most of our employer clients on retention, if you lose someone in the first 6 to 9 months, it's anywhere from a ten to $15,000 hit to the bottom line. And so you just think about what happens in high churn industries. To your question, a lot of our clients are blue collar, but we're doing a lot of work in professional services, for example, and in finance, in tech related businesses. This is a problem that affects everyone, not perhaps equally, but it affects everyone because the numbers just don't work.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So it's a multivariate problem, and I'd love to dig into, like, how much of it is just the people aren't there, and that could tie into things as complicated as fertility rates and all that, versus the people that were in those jobs have moved on to being TikTok influencers or something.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot more options for young people today. A lot of sort of our, I'd say, past generations' expectations of work and workforce. I mean, my father never understood why I had a few different jobs before I kind of settled down. He got a law degree and became an attorney and worked at the same firm for his whole career. It's a very different world today. Part of the pain that we're feeling, in addition to the fact that I think young people and people who choose alternative career paths have options that sort of remove them from a more traditional workforce. The other side of that coin is the aging population. And during the Great Recession, there were a lot of boomers who probably planned to retire sooner, but because of the recession, may have had savings wiped out. It extended their careers for years longer than intended originally. And they are now leaving the workforce in mass and they're not coming back. So another statistic is 90% of boomers who are in the workforce today will be gone in the next 3 to 5 years. That's scary when you think about the amount of knowledge that that group and that cohort will take with them.
Yeah, and it's definitely, in my opinion, one of these things that's not talked about anywhere nearly enough. We're just inundated with fluff based on these signals that just change every day, no matter what, like employment rates or the economy, when there's this underlying structural anvil that's about to fall on our head. So anyway, to take this more to the agency side, because then hopefully be useful to people and listeners and stuff. How did you first kind of see this as an opportunity, and when did it start becoming obvious that this was how you were gonna specialize?
So that's a great question. We were hired to brand and bring to the market a report that a multi agency group in Birmingham had done. It was called Building It Together. And it was an examination of the workforce in and around Birmingham at that time. And you learned a lot. I mean, there's so many learnings from that report, but just to sort of help to clarify what it yielded, it showed that every year in Birmingham, we graduate about 1,000 fewer kids with degrees in IT than there are entry level jobs available that year. And you start to think about the compounding effect of what that means for employers in this area who have those types of needs. So it is a real challenge, but that's where we got curious about the problem when we did that work back in 2016. And before we had sort of finished the work related to building it together to the market, we had already been engaged by an industry association, actually in healthcare, who had noticed a real challenge in terms of the number of people coming in to apply for those jobs. So we've kind of evolved from then. It was that moment when we began to get curious about this problem, and then sort of, I'd say organically, a client sort of manifested, and it got what really is a very curious team of problem solvers at the agency really focused on how do we address this problem.
Yeah, and from that standpoint, is there anything that surprised you about the way people are looking for jobs and maybe how that's changed?
Well, there's so many options that are not traditional. I mean, you mentioned earlier influencers, and that world is, there's a lot of change happening in that world right now and will continue to. But you just look across the workforce population from an age demographic perspective, and you start to understand. I mean, young people, you look at athletes and NIL, kids coming out of high school are making more money in some instances than professional athletes are. And it's the world's kind of been turned upside down a little bit at a moment in time, sort of during and after the pandemic, where there's just a lot in flux anyway. And as these things start to become a little bit more regulated, as there's a little more structure to how, for example, NIL works, I think we're going to see the economy of that particular sector start to not wash out, but you're going to see a more predictable curve from an economic perspective. I don't know what effect that ultimately has on the workforce population as a whole. I think that the reality is more and more people are choosing not to work. In a full employment economy, usually about 70% is the top range of what you would expect from a participation perspective. That accounts for people who are in school, or someone who may be home with a child or an infant, or maybe in a position or a circumstance where they don't have to work. So 70% is sort of the high range of workforce participation. 60% is definitely a low range. And each of those numbers represents hundreds of thousands of employees in the economy. So it's a big difference. That gulf is pretty severe. And if we can't get people re-engaged in the workforce, and if immigration, which is obviously a politicized issue, but if immigration doesn't create more people coming into the workforce, we will continue to grapple with this problem for years to come. And it will affect some industries a bit more severely than others, but no industry is going to be immune from the fact that there are just fewer people to do the work.
Right, right. And how is that affecting how you're communicating with applicants, and specifically like how have the cultural values changed? I think that it seems like now there's not a lot of meaning or value placed on anything. Like there used to be, the idea of like of working for the American dream. That's kind of gone. There's working just because working itself is valuable. That's kind of like the Japanese model. There's giving up on everything, which is like hippies, I guess, or something. And then there's the kind of bootstrapped entrepreneur, which I would say is a mix between the hippie and the American dream model. And then there's the mafia, which is the crooked ladder, like American dream without the work. What would you like? I don't want to slot you into those few, but how would you describe what people are valuing when you're kind of going out there to help recruit?
Your question makes me sort of think of the way that the US Army has advertised people to pursue a career in the Army.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, probably when you were a kid, the mantra, what you might hear in a commercial, for example, was be all you can be, like aspire to be in this place and to do this thing by joining the army. It evolved over the last several years to an army of one. Everything has become so individualized. And I think one of the most important lessons that we have learned is you must communicate articulately and accurately when doing anything in this space. Anything that is even a stretch of the truth is going to yield problems, even if there's a short term benefit. For example, if we promise for a particular client that we pay at the top of the market, but after someone joins that company and they don't experience what we've promised, they're going to lose or lose interest. And so that person is going to leave. So I think what has really changed over the course of a generation or so is the expectation has become not what am I going to do for the employer, what is the employer going to do for me? And if you don't reach people on that level while at the same time educating them about the expectations that are required in order to be successful, the hurdles that you're going to have to go through, if you don't paint a very real and clear picture, people are going to feel lied to. So I think it's a healthier environment to communicate in that regard. But what we saw during the pandemic, especially in an environment where just in the trades, just in construction, we saw 14 months of 5% increases month over month in salary starts. That's clearly not sustainable. And for a long period of time, that was where we were because the urgency that those employers felt was on the recruitment side. But what it created on the back end were serious retention issues. And I think in this economy, retention issues have normalized a bit, but there's still going to be problems there just because numbers are what they are. Demand is higher than supply. And on the recruitment side, I think that those employers or those industries that don't think differently about how to reach people and where to reach them are not going to see the type of benefits as those who take the time to do that work right.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. But let's talk about offshoring a little bit. Do you feel like there are still lots of industries that could or would be disrupted by offshoring, or do you feel like we've kind of reached a mature market there, or something else?
In our space in particular,
Yeah, with workforce solutions in general. Yeah.
I think that there are some industries where offshoring can make sense, and those tend to be obvious. There are a lot of industries where offshoring has been attempted with varying levels of success, and in some industries where it's just not been successful at all. I think at the end of the day, markets tend to take care of themselves. I think if your business or your industry needs more supply than is available, or is looking for sometimes cheaper supply or a workforce supply, so to speak, that has a skill set that may be endemic to a particular geography. Those can be more sustainable models, but offshoring for offshoring's sake isn't always advantageous or accretive.
Yeah, it definitely is contextual, and I always think of white collar more because blue collar is a lot bigger decisions, probably a lot more infrastructure involved in that kind of thing. So that makes sense. I think to shift gears a bit, can you talk about the decision to specialize? Like what did it feel like in the agency when you were making that decision? I'm not sure if you have partners or not, or maybe just your team, but what were those conversations like?
Well, it's a great question. The earliest days of those conversations were not super comfortable. I think we wrestled with what is the effect on the market if we start talking about ourselves as more focused around employer branding and workforce solutions? What is the effect on the team? What do we say to a team member who maybe hasn't done as much of that work as another team member? So we really wrestled with it for a while. But I think at the end of the day, businesses in our industry are better off being more focused around the types of problems that they're best at solving.
Yeah.
And I think our team loves cool, creative projects that come through the agency. As a business, if we were competing for a rebrand in Denver, Colorado, for example, there are a lot of agencies that kind of look like us and talk like us and have great examples of work that maybe qualify them uniquely for a particular project. But relationships are really powerful in our industry, and proximity can be very powerful in those decision making processes. So, despite the hand wrangling that we experienced early on in these conversations, it's really been a great benefit to our team and to our company to be more focused around the types of problems that we're solving, especially outside the state. I mean, Alabama's economy, that we have a lot of really talented agencies in Alabama, and the economy is only so big. So we can't rely on our local economy and economies across the state to continue to grow our business. And so having a area of specialty where we can compete head to head with just about anyone anywhere obviously has benefits from a business perspective.
Yeah, definitely agree. One common objection to specializing that I think you see more with creative agencies than other types of agencies is if we specialize, then we will no longer be able to do fresh and changing work, and then our team will get bored, and then everyone will quit, and it'll be horrible. How much did that happen or not happen?
Well, I think that see a huge fall off in terms of the numbers of people, the numbers of clients who are coming in for more, what I would say, broader types of things that most agencies do. So the rebrands, websites, sales collateral, event activation, all of those things that I think all of us as agencies spend some time doing. Those still come through the agency, and sometimes they're really fun projects. Sometimes they're very complicated, but the workforce piece, what we do is exciting, and helping our clients solve this problem, find creative solutions to problems that haven't really been looked at through a creative lens, probably in a very long time. One of the things that we find, and I think this is true of any agency doing work anywhere, you find solutions to problems that you weren't necessarily trying to solve. And so we've got a lot of experience in this arena just by virtue of the fact that we're doing the work. So it's been very interesting in those regards. But there was some fear early on in those conversations, but I think the reality is there's plenty of creative work flowing through the agency, even if it's tied to employer branding or workforce solutions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one thing that we talk a lot about on the show is how much the agency model is changing in terms of what it means to be an agency can mean a lot of different things. There's agencies that build their own software and have training, like we've developed much bigger of a training model than we used to have. And what I'd imagine is that for what you guys do, there's a real marketplace dynamic. You can almost have, the buy side and the sell side for labor. Can you talk about that a little bit? How has that played out as an idea, and how do you feel about becoming bigger than just an agency or changing up the model in some way?
Well, it's a great question. We really consider ourselves a more of a consulting firm in a lot of ways than an agency today. I think we say agency because that's what our clients will associate us as. But our work is so predicated on data on the front end, usually data that we get from our clients. But we have to be able to supplement existing data almost every time we do this work. And the ability to measure your work in real time so that you know not just what are the messages that are resonating, what are the actions that people are taking based on that message, and what's the cost of a lead or a converted lead, but what is the client, what is the problem the client's trying to solve? Because a lot of agencies will talk about KPIs as it relates to their business, which may not have anything to do with what the client cares. What the client cares about, are we seeing more qualified leads? Are we converting more people as a percentage of folks who we are getting to potentially apply for these jobs? So I think for us, as we look at our business, the complexity of what our clients are dealing with creates a lot of opportunities for us to help them. And that's been really nice. I'm not sure that perfectly answers your question, but
No, it does, and I we've seen that for ourselves. We're specializing on agencies, and a lot of it is just being able to use the terms of art, to kind of get into the nuances that are sometimes very subtle, but that go a long way. Like in our business, there's a gazillion companies spamming our prospects and clients about getting hundreds or thousands of leads a month. And we're like, no, we're going to help you build systems for getting a few relationships a week, right? Which is
Yeah.
like the most that any sizable agency would generally want or could handle, depending on their situation. Are there any examples that pop out to you in that way about like things you were able to do from specializing that you weren't able to do before?
Well, this sort of carried over from sort of life before we were doing a lot in this area of employer branding, but a lot of this is coalition management. When you're working with an association or when you're working with a coalition, there tend to be a lot of decision makers. And when you're working with an association, that board may turn over or there may be leadership transitions. And so there's a lot of work in communicating at various levels within an organization or within a board what it is that you're doing and why it's important, and educating them so that those transitions can be managed pretty well. When working with employers, and to varying levels, this can be true, but in a lot of ways, when we work with a large employer on a workforce initiative, it may be the first time that HR and comms or marketing has worked together in a very meaningful way at the enterprise level. And that can be difficult. It's difficult trusting another group who you haven't necessarily, maybe you eat lunch with that guy once a week or once a month, but actually getting into a foxhole and trying to tackle big problems together might be kind of new. And so those pieces, I think, are not so much terms of art, but it takes experience to be artful in how you manage through those types of coalitions or those types of relationships. And then the ability, just by doing this work repeatedly, to recognize certain characteristics and especially personas that we develop and how we go after them. I think persona is one of those words that means a lot of things to every different agency and probably views it differently. Our personas are not demographic characterizations. We're not looking for 35 to 50-year-old white men for a particular job. We're looking for a group of people who fit a particular motivation and are good fits for a job. And that yields much more diverse groups, as you can imagine, if you develop personas based on motivator than on demographic composition. So we've learned a lot about different groups based on motivations. And I think that's another piece of this that comes with experience. It's hard to just jump into that kind of work and quickly get to what a motivation persona looks like versus what a demographic based persona does.
Yeah, and what I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, is the force that's leading it is the fact that these companies are hiring hundreds or thousands of people versus one or two. I forgot where I've heard this metaphor, but it's like if you had to eat one food for the rest of your life, you'd probably have to pick a potato or something that has nutrients in it. If you can have, a dozen, then you can eat in an eclectic way, right? So I think that probably lends itself to it. I think one thing that you kind of touched on that I found interesting is kind of this coalition building between different sectors of a large organization. And Rory Sutherland, he's a great marketing thinker, had a really interesting post about how you always hear about the building of movements, and branding is always ascribed to like consumer marketing. Like Nike builds all this stuff around what it means to wear Nike. But the reality is like B2B actually has a much stronger argument for needing to do that, because you've got to sway all these people, a whole group, in order for them to either buy or not buy from you, versus just, consumer, you're in your boxers scrolling on your phone and now you buy a product. Like you don't
Right.
need a movement for that. You just need some basic signals to get hit. Any thoughts on that, or anything you guys have done to sort of do that coalition building within these big organizations?
It is really, it takes time and purposeful effort. And it's very difficult to cut corners in managing coalitions. I think at the outset, understanding what a coalition is committed to doing together. It's an important conversation that we have with our clients. And what are the rules of engagement for a coalition? I mean, just to give you a sense, we've had certain coalitions that will only make decisions when they are unanimous. And you can imagine the challenge if there is but one dissenting opinion on one particular topic related to one campaign, much less, a series of campaigns, or you add to that complexity transition in title or job or what have you. So, and then you layer on top of it economic changes and budgetary concerns and all of the coalition management work that we've done. We've found that, especially if it's a coalition and not an industry association, you really have to have a backbone support organization who's helping to herd the cats. Because if you don't have that, it's just very, very hard to manage a group in the absence of a leader. And the hired gun agency can't always be that leader, right? And look, we operate in a world where relationships and politics, even at a sort of micro level in a small community, they are important. And if you don't put in the time on the front end to understand those dynamics, you'll regret it as you get into the work. But what has been great for our team is knowing that we're helping our clients solve very challenging, meaningful problems that they clearly are struggling to solve in our absence or by themselves, whether we have the best solution or not. And I think for us, we're very interested in continuing to deepen our knowledge and awareness of personas. We've done a ton of this work throughout the spectrum from blue collar to white collar, but we've done a ton of this work in blue collar careers. And so taking all of those learnings and making use of that knowledge that our team has is something that we're putting a real sort of priority.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it doesn't happen overnight that you develop that expertise, especially if you're working with 100 different industries or use cases. So I think that drives that point home. Shifting gears a little bit, can you talk a little bit about biz dev, kind of how you're handling that? Are you still in that seat, or do you have somebody helping you there? And how has that sort of evolved over time?
Business development is the lifeblood of an agency. And I think that it's incumbent on an agency to engage as many members of the team in that world as possible, even if their role is to create an outline for a piece of business or share the types of brands or prospective clients that they are interested in working with. Our idea has always been to allow team members wherever possible to work on clients who they are particularly interested in. But I'm still very, very focused on business development. We have had over the years business development professionals on our team. We have worked with a couple of different outside agencies to help us with that, not only on the sort of lead gen business development side, just more hands on deck, trying to get seats at the table with more and more prospects, but also the messaging piece. I mean, messaging is a critical component to what we do. It always has been. Obviously, in workforce and employer branding, getting the message right is really important. But I think agencies, like a lot of different people, it's hard to do it for yourself. The cobbler's son wears no shoes. And so we have not been afraid to engage outside talent to help us at times craft a message or supplement the business development activities that we're engaging in directly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it sounds like a good idea to practice what you preach from getting outside perspective. So, kind of getting towards the end of our time, what's exciting you? Like, what are you working on over the next 3, 6, 12 months that you're excited about?
I'm really excited about doing more of the work that we're doing in employer branding and workforce space. It is really fun. It is very challenging. And that world is going to continue to evolve. Watching what's happening with the workforce and layering on top of it what's happening culturally and politically and socially in our country and elsewhere, you learn a lot. That context is really helpful. The other thing that we're working on, we're building a software as a solution to support the work that we're doing. So that will certainly have a lot of my time and attention over the next couple of years as we hopefully have a market viable product that we roll out. Our team has not managed a software as a solution before. So I suspect there will be a lot of learnings from doing this the first time and from soliciting help from people who are not currently working at the agency.
Yeah, that sounds very exciting. And where can people go to follow what you're up to and get in touch and everything?
www.markstein.co, Markstein.co.
Awesome. We'll get that linked up. This has been great and really excited to see how the projects you're working on evolve and how all these macro forces evolve, hopefully in a good direction. We'll see.
Well,
Danny,
we'll keep you posted, Dan. I really appreciate the invitation to join you today.
likewise, really appreciate it. Thanks, Danny.